preacher has another entity that kind of just takes over his life for about 22 years. Some people said it was a gift from God. Other people said it was a curse of the devil. Well, here's the facts, and I'm going to let you decide. Well, hello there, my silky friends. It's another Sunday, and you know what that is. If you are new here, I'm Lily, and on Sundays, we have Silky Story Time. And I try to do stories that are vintage, and these stories focus on people you have probably never heard about. Yeah, I don't really do murder so much. It does show up. I'm not gonna lie. Like, murder just seems to show up in these stories. But that's not the focus. The focus here is people and stories that should be told. And maybe we learned something. There are just no words for today's story. This is absolutely insane. Okay, today's tea, very berry, because this story is very scary. Not in the ghost tradition, okay? This is not a ghost story. There is nothing ghostly paranormal about it. However, this is a very, to me, paranormal story, because, like, it ain't normal. So if you haven't already, grab your cup of tea, and we're going to dive in. I call this my Aunt Jenny hat because this is the hat I used for the Aunt Jenny story. And I love Aunt Jenny. So here we go. We are going to talk about the Reverend Sanders. I've never heard of such in my whole life. And this is right here in my state in Alabama. And if I haven't talked about your state, well, honey, when I run out of stories of Alabama, I'll be moving to Tennessee and Georgia and Florida and Texas. We gonna hit them all. Might have to get my glasses out sometimes, because I can't see. Okay, his name was Constantine Sanders, and he was born in Madison County, Alabama in 1831. He had a relatively normal, as far as we know, growing up, and he decided to become a preacher. However, when he was only 23 years old, he was staying with Mr. and Mrs. Harlow in Elkton, Tennessee, when all of a sudden he became very, very ill. They thought he was going to die. He laid in the bed and languished for a long time. And then something really bizarre started happening. There was a swelling in his head. And I'm not talking about the regular, what we know today as encephalitis. I'm a nurse, so, you know, they have to drill holes in your skull. That wasn't like this. His head actually started coming apart. You know, you've kind of heard that expression, my head just exploded. Well, his actually did. Like, his brains didn't fall out, but those plates in his head, they just started stretching. And they started stretching apart. And there he was, laying in the bed. And Mrs. Harlow said that there was a schism. Am I saying that right? There was a schism, like in between, like there was a space where all these plates were coming out. And his skin was over it, and I guess it kind of had some indentations. And she said she could stick her whole finger down in between. That's how far the brain plates had come apart. Somebody should have told her that ain't a good idea. Don't do that. So along with this, Constantine Sanders, he did recover. He had terrible after effects. He had blinding headaches. Well, you can imagine. And sometimes he would literally have to put a rag or something around his eyes because the light was just too much. And sometimes he would just go into a trance. And when he went into this trance, sometimes he would actually stop breathing. Well, he was declared dead a couple of times, and then all of a sudden, he started breathing again. He thus became known as the sleeping preacher. Not only did he kind of go into a trance-like state, but he seemed to gain superpowers. Yeah, he could find missing objects. He could read the contents of a letter that was sealed and across the room. He made predictions, and he did all kind of stuff that I guess people would probably call paranormal. As you can imagine, he was quite the talk of the town. His friends used to kind of enjoy his shenanigans because he was an oddity. and they found him very entertaining when he wasn't too ill. Now here are some examples of things that the Reverend Sanders was able to do, and this was all written down in a book by very reputable people. So this isn't just some, he said, she said. One day he was on a train and he did not have any writing utensils. There was a woman in another cart who had a letter that she was reading. Well, he had one of those blinding headaches and his face was all covered. And he asked for a pen and paper, but nobody seemed to have one. So he starts literally taking his finger and writing on his hand. And he wrote and wrote and wrote. Well, then he gets up from his compartment and he walks to where the woman is. Now, even when he was blinded by these headaches or whatever and his eyes were covered, that he could still read a book and he could walk about the room as if he had full sight. That is mighty peculiar. So anyway, he goes over to this woman in the next compartment and he asks her to read parts of the letter. Well, she didn't want to do it. So he took out his hand where he had written all of this information, and even not being able to see and not actually having a pen and paper, he began to read the letter off of his hand that he had written. I don't think she was too happy about that. Another story is one night while he was traveling out in a buggy with some friends, they were just going down a country road, and all of a sudden he says, stop the carriage. And so the driver stops, and out goes Reverend Sanders. He walks over to the woods, and he's just standing there, and all of a sudden there is a fox that comes running out the woods and comes right to the Reverend and sits there and lets the Reverend pet him. Just a random fox. This man was so peculiar. Another thing that he did is whilst he was in the house with his headache and it was nighttime, he had some visitors come over and he told them that there was a gold coin at a certain place up the road on the side of the road, and if they went, they would find it. Well, they all took little candles and they hustled on out there trying to find that gold coin. Now, you could say that maybe he planted it beforehand. Oh, but no, because this is what happened. Well, they were all looking for the coin, and it was dark, and they only had little candles and just what was left of the moonlight. And they were walking all through the grass, and they didn't find squat. So they came back to the house and told him they didn't find any gold coin. He just laughed, and he said, well, this certain gentleman, he said, you were all around. As a matter of fact, your boot stepped on that coin, and now it is tilted up on its side, and this is what the coin looks like. And he described it completely, and he said, if you go out in the morning, you'll find it. Well, first light, they all went running out there, and lo and behold, they found that coin on its side with the boot prints, just like the Reverend had said. I wonder if there's any gold coins in my yard. Maybe I'll go look. So here's the last little thing I'm going to say about the stories before we get into the entity. Yeah, entity. So Reverend Sanders was really looking forward to hearing a sermon that was going to be done by F.A. Ross. Well, as they were waiting for the meeting to start, it was going to be an evening meeting, and this was much earlier in the day. Reverend Sanders started getting one of those bad headaches again, and he just told his friend, he said, look, I'm just going to go on back to the house. He said, I am not going to make it. He gets on the train. He goes home. Before the meeting, when his friend comes in, he hands him the outline of the sermon that he said the Reverend Ross was going to be preaching. So his friend looks at it. He's like, Well, when he goes back into town that night, he listens to the whole sermon. And of course, it fits the outline. When he gets back to the house, there is Reverend Sanders' wife watching him write the whole sermon out that F.A. Ross preached, verbatim. She hands it to his friend, and he looks at it, and he did confirm that that was exactly what the Reverend Ross had said. Now, here's where we get into the weird part. Yeah, if you don't think this is weird, just hold on to your bonnet. A lot of times during this 22 years of these weird events happening, sometimes Reverend Sanders would write letters while in his trance. And they would be letters explaining things. You know, it was all kind of phenomenal things he couldn't have known. Well, sometimes the Reverend Sanders got a letter for himself. Yeah, he wrote himself a letter. And the first one he got was from the entity that was taking over his brain while he was in a trance. Now, this entity called itself X plus Y equals Z. No name. Just an algebra equation. Have you ever heard of such? So people began to refer to this entity, X plus Y equals Z, as an alter ego. And he was the one that could do all the parlor tricks. So in this first letter that the entity wrote to Reverend Sanders, he referred to him as my casket. I mean the nerve. You're gonna take over my brain, split my head apart, and then you're gonna call me a casket? I don't think so. We fixing to fight. Of course, this was all bizarre, and some people said it was just a gift from God. Look at all of the wonderful things the Reverend could do. And other people said it was a curse of the devil. Although I don't have a definitive answer on that, I will say this. I don't think a gift of God is going to give you migraine headaches and make you stop breathing and excruciating pain in your chest. That don't sound like Jesus to me. I'm just saying. Anyway, he lived with this entity for 22 years. Well, I guess there were some perks. You could do all of this stuff, find lost stuff, make predictions, whatever. You were kind of a celebrity. I don't think it was worth it. In one of X plus Y equals Z's letter to his casket, he told him that he was fixing to go away, and he'd be gone for a while, but he'd be coming back. Take your time. In February of 1876, the Reverend got his first letter from X plus Y equals Z saying, we just call him X. What about that? The Reverend got a letter from X saying that he was going to be leaving soon. Hallelujah. Now, the last letter that he received was on May 5th, 1876, so a few months later. And look, I got to read you some of this. You ain't gonna believe this stuff, honey. X says, after 22 years of labor and suffering in and through the person of my casket, seriously, and for many years of that time, both a mystery and reproach to others, I now come to the end of my first engagement. My casket, I now come to address you before I depart. You have been to me greatly a submissive servant, in suffering, in contempt, in wonder, in reproach. Gee, thanks. Don't do me any favors. And then he says something interesting. Together we have dwelt in peace and unity, but at your request, I leave you for a time. So apparently the Reverend Sanders was getting a little sick of his crap. It wouldn't have taken me 22 years. Till I come, your head will remain the seat of great pain, and at times to you almost unbearable. Gee, thanks. But here's the interesting part. He says, my books and papers I leave in your charge, but these you are on no account to exhibit until I come. Give earnest heed. You up in there in my skull and now you threatening me. I just don't think so. X. Now, shortly after that, I don't have an exact date of when X plus Y equals Z decided to depart. It was in that same year that he decided to leave, with the warning, don't you show anybody all my books and papers until I come back. So what does the Reverend do? He publishes the letters and the books. along with testimonies of reliable witnesses of the strange events that have been going on for 22 years. So I have to wonder, did he do it on purpose, thinking, okay, if I do this and X told me not to, maybe he won't come back. I am so done with you. I think that might have been his motivation in the beginning. Well, in 1877, there was a second printing of this book, and I don't know if it was due to the popularity or the notoriety he had when he had X there in his head. I guess maybe he realized that he shouldn't have done that if he wanted X to return. So he gave a command that all of the books be returned. They were gathered together in Mooresville and burned. Fortunately, there was still a few copies out there that they didn't get to. So in 1981, someone who had an actual copy of that had it reprinted and then added to it stories and exploits and more explanation, and I believe some other letters that weren't published before. I don't know what the name of the book is. I would love to know. It was done by William P. Drake. So if any of y'all can find that, that would be very interesting. I guess because the Reverend did what X said, don't do this, there is no evidence that X ever made an appearance again. So after 1876, the Reverend lived on with his wife and family, and he passed away in 1911 on Good Friday and was buried on Easter Sunday. His wife passed away 2.5 years later, and that was the end of X. Now, I do not know if during that last almost 30 years, if he still had the headaches and stuff like that. There is no account that I could find whether his illness got better and his head got, I don't know what happened to his head. Hopefully it shrunk. Hopefully the plates went back together. Who knows? Reverend Sanders was a preacher at the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and in 1973 they moved that little church onto the campus of the University of Alabama in Huntsville, where it still stands today, and it is a student art gallery. So I want to know what you think. What was this entity? Was it like demonic possession? Was it just a brain injury? But yet, how could he do all of these miraculous things if that's what it was? I don't know. And it's not like the medical community could have helped a whole lot back in those days. I don't know who or what X was, but I can tell you this. He sure had his nerve. I'm just saying. Don't be coming and taking over my head for 22 years. There's enough going on up there. I know this story was a little bit different. There's no criminal or ghostly element in this one, and yet I find it fascinating. Have you ever heard of such a thing, or the Reverend Sanders? I hadn't, strangely enough. Comment below and tell me what are your thoughts on what might have been wrong with him medically. Do you have any idea, all you medical people? If you like to hear stories that you've probably never heard, and if they're very hard to find, then please like, subscribe, and I will see you next week with another cup of tea, and I think it's time for a nap again. But remember to stay silky.